Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for coming, and especially thank you to Dr. Jo Angouri, who's here from University of Warwick. She is a professor in sociolinguistics and also the university level academic director for education and internationalization at University of Warwick. And in addition, she's a visiting distinguished professor in a lot of places. I meant to ask you how to pronounce these places, but Aalto University Business, Finland, and Monash University, Australia. She's a research associate at the University of Wellington, New Zealand. She holds a Lanoy Chair for Multilingualism at the Free University, Brussels, and has extensively published on multilingualism, identity, decision-making, leadership, and research methodology. She's the author of a book called Culture, Discourse, and the Workplace, published by Routledge, and has co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Language, Gender, and Sexuality, Negotiating Boundaries at Work, and upcoming book called Migration and Exclusion in the Workplace, being published by Multilingual Matters. She's subject chair for linguistics, language, communication, and media on the Scopus board. She's a national teaching fellow and principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. She is committed to pedagogic innovation and education with global citizenship. And last but not least, she's my friend and colleague, and I'm so pleased to have you here, Jo. Looking forward to your presentation and discussions afterwards. And just also, well, I guess this was more for people who are here, but we'll stick around, and some of us might go out if you want to join us for further chatting after the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the very generous introduction. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and privilege to really have the opportunity to share ideas and learn together. And thank you very much in particular for really opening up and making possible to actually bring together colleagues and students from different backgrounds that actually connect different strands of work, and also to acknowledge all the good work that we have been doing over the years. So to actually have the opportunity to understand and see more in terms of the good work that you're doing here is really a very exciting opportunity, and probably one of the reasons that academia is such a really creative space. So it's an absolute pleasure, and thank you all to all the colleagues who joined us online. I know it's a very busy time of the year, and what I'm going to do today is try indeed and connect different strands of work and have the opportunity really to open to discussion some of my current thinking, and I would be very interested in how that may or may not connect to the ways and the disciplinaries that we have in the room, because that's also something that I think is very important, that the kind of issues that I'm interested in are really go beyond disciplinary boundaries, national boundaries, linguistic boundaries, and so on, are kind of common phenomena and issues that we need to address as a sector in terms of thinking how we educate for the future. So I would be very interested in actually really see how that resonates, or what you actually see things from a different angle that we could actually explore together. So what I'm going to do is talk about internationalization and transnational education, and particularly with a reference to multilingual pedagogies. And I tried to make the most of the fact that generously you gave me an hour, so I thought I would squeeze in about 4 different lines of work. So please at some point indicate, because I'm going to not focus too much on sort of monitoring time, but give me an indication when I should start wrapping up. And, you know, in a sense, I have about 10-15 minutes to sort of make sure we have time for discussion as well.
Do you want me to give you
yeah, just sort of if you just give me an indication when I have 15 minutes left each, I think that's plenty. Just so that I don't go into too much of a detail and eat our discussion time. So I'm going to talk on some of the current work on internationalization. The particular points of reference that I will have is work that is taking place currently in Europe, but I'm very interested in how that applies and connects with the work and experience that we actually have on internationalization and transnational collaboration globally. And I'm going to then look into multilingualism and share a case of what we are currently doing and the relevance of this current work and the policy environment for multilingual pedagogies. Some of the conversation that I will be drawing upon is also reflected in the paper that was launched yesterday under the Guilds of Research Intensive Universities in Europe. You actually have that, and it is on transnational collaboration and mobility in higher education. I'm going to come back to the work we're doing there and how that connects with other projects that are ongoing. Okay, so none of anything that I've said so far is new, and the kind of either the actual priorities or the issues, they have been around for a very long time, and internationalization in higher education in Europe is certainly not new, as isn't in other parts of the world, of course. But with particular reference to Europe, we have a number of policy tools that are very well established, and they've created a legacy and the foundation for transnational collaboration, for mobility, for staff-student mobility, and for actually really connecting both in research and in teaching and learning. And I think everybody in this room and in this call would be familiar with Bologna, what has been achieved, what has not been achieved, but also all the kind of the work that is enabled by within the European education area and by the quality assurance standards, but also how at the same time, the flip side of this is that, of course, education is nationally regulated, and we know that there are still the barriers in transnational collaboration, particularly at joint degree level, that are there, and that's part of the work of the European Commission right now to actually think how we could use what we already have and the legacy of the past, and then move into further enhancing collaboration and being able to transcend those barriers. So this is very much where I want to go, and there is a what I often referred to as a European moment in higher education. There is definitely a lot of attention and a lot of emphasis on that, and that's something that, in my view, also creates the conditions and the opportunity for the sector, definitely in Europe, but also, of course, beyond, to actually look into how we could work with policymakers to bring the change that we want to see. I spent all my life in education, or my adult life, well, all my life, but as a professional, my adult life in education. And I think it's the first time that I see so much emphasis by national and international policymakers on the transformational potential of education. I see a lot of conversation in public domains about education, about degrees, about the concept of value of a degree. And it is, to me, fundamental that universities continue leading the conversation, and we continue doing all the things that we do well, but we also grab the opportunity to think what it is that we may want to do differently. And we know that there are areas where we want to synchronize our offering to the world around us. And we know that we're educating for the future, which means that we're educating for a future that would means having complex problems, having disrupted societies, and having our students, the current students and the future students, will have to face and work on problems that we currently don't know. But we know that there will be what we call wicked problems, or complex problems, where they will need to be able to apply disciplinary training for interdisciplinary approaches. They will need to work the interface of national context, linguistic context, and so on. So in a sense, as we as a sector need to find ways to transcend those borders, our students of the present and our students of the future would certainly need to be able to operate in a very different environment. This is very much also reflected in the kind of work on the European University Initiative and the European University Alliances. I don't know how much colleagues follow this work, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we can pedal back into any of those later on. The sort of the gist and a sort of short summary, and there are various links on the top, and we can share slides with colleagues, is that there is this work that is often associated with Macron's 2017 speech on really pushing for more collaboration between universities in Europe, for really finding ways to go beyond the barriers of the past, so students can actually work and benefit from networks of universities, to have access to European education, to real European education, and to actually go in a sense beyond the designs that we currently have as study abroad and so on, but really have more mobility, more integration, more opportunity to actually benefit from the potential of the European education area. In the sort of the current moment, that followed sort of the work of the Commission, and there are 44 European University Alliances. The University of Warwick is a member in one of those alliances, which is called EUtopia, and I will come back to that and share a case on that. But there is also a very interesting piece of work that is growing around it, and I'm very interested in connecting the work on multilingualism that I'm going to turn to in a minute with the work that is actually creates this environment, this context where universities are encouraged nationally, internationally, to think of transnational collaboration and think of different ways of pedagogic offering. Any of those words means that we're already in a multilingual space. Of course, at the same time, it comes with all the opportunities, but also the constraints that we've had over the years, right? Because none of those in and by itself is new. What is new right now is that we come from the disruption of COVID-19. We actually come from an environment where we actually saw changes and a different way of moving to this kind of post-digital university. We came from also seeing the value and the importance of social learning, the impact that the disruption had on our students. So we actually saw the good and the bad, and we also have been doing, and we have a lot of course, knowledge from what we've been doing over the years and the research we do. So the current, all this sort of policy environment associates collaboration with attractiveness, competitiveness, resilience, and so on. There is a very strong discourse on that. And we're talking in detail in the paper that was launched yesterday, so I'm not going to get into that in any further detail at this stage. But there is also very specific and very ambitious targets. So mobility targets, for example, is a good example, where there is an overall 20% sort of European Commission level of mobility targets in the traditional designs, which goes up to 50% mobility within European university alliances. Now, any colleague who has been working in education, research, or sort of have done anything around mobility, study abroad, international, intercultural, would know that 50% really goes very far from the lived experience of the majority of the sector. Actually, 20% goes quite far from the lived experience of the majority of the sector. And the 10% you see on the slide is in relation to what in the UK call widening participation, but these are students from non-traditional backgrounds where actually mobility is even lower. So we actually have this model, and I'm sort of going to try and fast track a little bit and probably come back to this. But when we talk about international, we often talk on different sort of metrics. We talk less on internationalization of the curriculum in and by itself. And of course, internationalization of the curriculum is more difficult to turn to metrics, such as how many students go from X to Y, or how many of our staff come from nationality X or Y, and so on. Of course, it is already debatable whether the sort of the metrics that are associated with internationalization indicators are really the ones that really give us a sort of an insight into the kind of true international. But I'm going to not start being too critical at this stage, because otherwise I think I'm going to spend all my time with those 5 slides. So I want to turn to the multilingualism end now. Now, multilinguals, there is a lot of commitment on multilingualism in the EU. Again, everybody in this call, I think, would be very familiar with this work. And you will have seen this type of Eurobarometer graphs in different ways with the commitment of acquiring more than one language and being able to be proficient. And we can actually talk about what that means. We will in a minute. And also having the actual a multilingual commitment in the functions and the work of European institutions. So this has been around for a very long time. And also, if you were fast readers, you would have seen that already in the Macron speech, there is again reference to the more than two languages. So surely for any researcher on multilingualism, this is good. And this is certainly a very open and explicit commitment on multilingualism. But at the same time, there are certain limitations with it. And that is already very interesting to actually see how we can actually start thinking, what does multilingualism mean in this context? And when we actually bring together what multilingualism means in the context of this sort of policy, we can actually also see how multilingualism is traditionally seen in education and what it means when we want to offer this open, fluid, transnational environment for the students, because this is actually really an opportunity, right? We do have an encouragement by the sector to rethink, work more, embed collaboration. This all means we're in a very multilingual space. And we also in Europe, of course, we operate in the context where there is a commitment to multilingualism. So this kind of Eurobarometer data and so on have been around for a very long time. Now, what is actually an opportunity to rethink what we mean by multilingualism comes with the fact that we are quite focusing on particular framing of language in the way we understand multilingualism generally and in education in particular. And this has to do with the fact that we understand language as a national variety typically, and we associate a nation with a language. Now, this already, and I don't think I need to go into too much hard work in Canada to explain that this is actually not a linguistic decision, but it's rather a political decision. And of course, if we start creating this kind of layers, because in a sense we are in a 3D space where we've already, I tried to sketch a little bit the policy context, position the university, position the policy, and position the sort of the way we understand language in this sort of matrix. We actually are in a space where we have different political, ideological, and other agendas being very, very much relevant to practice. So what is actually some of the issues that you actually see on the slides are where multilingualism education has been based on, and is actually where we have an opportunity to build on where we had a lot of work actually challenging those positions and suggesting alternatives, but also thinking how those alternatives can really come to the fore into this context where we want to create transnational model spaces for students and staff and non-academic partners to come together. So multilingualism as a sort of sum of national languages very much focuses on the presupposition that we do have national languages, and then we actually can sort of add them up. Multilingualism then is often associated as the use of inverted commas global languages. I really don't like those labels, but anyway, I'm sort of using them to indicate positions that often is English, of course. Multilingualism and multilingual education having as a purpose and as an aim for the students to develop inverted commas competence, and competence then often means sound and linguistically behave, and that's really important. Native-like, and of course there is an enormous amount of research around each of those. But also what is to me very important, and I see this being perpetuated even when we actually want to challenge any of the previous position, is that we start by saying, this is a problem. We have a problem, and it may not be framed as a problem, it may be framed as a complexity, as an issue, as a challenge, and so on. But we're in a space where we think, oh, we actually have this multilingual profile, of a sort of student cohort, what do we do with it? Instead of actually starting, oh, great, we actually had a real opportunity, we have an asset. How can we mobilize it? How can we actually empower those students to really benefit from it? And this is where my research on multilingualism has been over the years. So what I'm doing today is to actually bring two sides of myself. There's sort of the work I've been doing in my sort of sociolinguistic work and the sort of multilingualism, language choice, ideology, and how we actually negotiate all that in professional environments, which of course education in one is for ourselves as professional academics and for our students. And the work I've been doing on education and internationalization, and particularly I'm very interested in the future of research-led higher education and what it means and how we can truly achieve international education. So the kind of my sort of position and my interest, and I'm trying to sort of broadly keep a little bit of our time, is to think how we need to shift from a particular understanding of language to the user. And this is what I have been doing over the years, and I'm very interested in how this is possible within the current context, with the current educational context. I just have no sense, I have no way to see time.
The time is 1:05,
Okay,
and I'm going to give you 15
Perfect.
minutes notice
Okay.
in 15 minutes.
perfect.
Half
Okay,
an hour.
that's great.
Have a
Because
half.
I only see the screen, I have
No,
no
it takes
time
it
anyway, so
all.
that's fine, that's great. So, so if we want to create spaces where we shift from the language to the user, I'm very interested in thinking, how do we do that in the curricular and co-curricular journeys of the students? And also, how do we do this pragmatically? Because I'm also very concerned that we don't create a space where we actually say, this is a liberal space, which is safe to take risks, which is safe to be multilingual, but in order to pass, you need to write your essays, which will be marked against a particular standard. And also, you need to operate in a particular genre, which sounds and looks like a particular variety, which may be the academic variety of a language, right? So I'm thinking variety in the sociolinguistic terms, and you want to publish in journals, and we all have editorial roles in this room, and we know exactly how pieces of work are assessed. So we are operating in a political environment, and this needs to be very much hard from the start. If we are to think of really creating those spaces where we rethink our pedagogic offering, we rethink transnational collaboration, we rethink what the policymakers want us to do, which is great. And actually, what I see, again, my points of reference is Europe, and I really want to have a discussion as to how this resonates in your experience. But we have extremely good buy-in. So the sector and the university participating are participating. So despite all the possible barriers that are still in place in terms of resource and support and so on, we can talk more about that. But how can we actually really have this momentum where we don't fall into the barriers of the past? And also, how can we actually really move from micro scale experimentation and micro scale programming to something that could be available to all our students? And that is also very important, because when we talk international, it's really very important to have the policy target. Policy targets are very important to mobilize. When we have a policy target of 50% of some type of mobility in a sector where typically we have under 10%, how do we get there? And also, the other part is that universities we have thousands of students, right? So we have about 30,000. What is the population of the student population of the University of Toronto?
Okay.
But
50 to 60,000.
so even if we talk 10%, 20%, 50%, which is 50% is really not our lived experience of the sector. What about the others? And also we know that there are groups of students in many good studies, and Erasmus has been absolutely fantastic because we have so much good data over the years where we know that there are certain groups of students that are consistently underrepresented in Erasmus. And we all know, and colleagues coming from an education, sort of broadly put education studies background, would know much better than I do that actually if we are really serious about widening participation in my UK language, or empowering those who actually don't come from particular environments that have been traditionally seen as the majority or the norm. It's not enough to say, okay, I'm going to put an X amount on the table and you can have a bursary, because those students have a completely different life trajectory, needs, see opportunity, and so on. And the assumption that one can go and is obviously one that's not.
I think that some of the students online, or of the people online, might not know what Erasmus is.
Okay, all right. So, all right. So Erasmus is an established scheme, I would say, and we can define it together, because I think that that's actually very good. So it's a program. It's a program of activities that has been set, that your testimony 92 or 87.
I think. Oh, okay. You might know
but
better.
anyway, around then, it doesn't matter, around then. And it is really to enable mobility of staff and students. It's particularly a sort of study abroad. So to spend a semester or a year in a different institution. And also the same applies for academic staff. It has also been over the years expanded and extended to also include short-term mobility, but also is associated with funding studies around educational collaboration and international mobility.
Within Europe, right?
Within Europe, but also there are ways to enable global collaboration. Roughly. So and we can talk more about it, but it's actually really enabling mobility between institutions. Okay, so within that, the kind of moving into the sort of more linguistic part is when we talk about language and kind of creating those multilingual spaces. It's very important that we know that we're in a place where we have a lot of evidence and studies that actually will tell us that the language we use and the choice of language is never neutral. It comes with social evaluations. So all languages are, as I tell when I start teaching my students, is that all languages, all varieties, if you want to move away from languages, also is kind of has particular denominations, but all languages are linguistically equal, but socially and politically unequal. So language choice is not random. It's not something that the individual user would actually make a choice only on the basis of personal preference or reading of environment and so on. A number of societal, political and other constraints would regulate either what is expected as a performance or the consequences when this is not met. So today, for example, most colleagues didn't know me, I suppose, or haven't had the chance to be in one of my talks, but everybody came with specific expectations of what a senior academic looks like, sounds like, what type of English variety, in terms of the style and so on. And your expectations so far are being met, and I don't intend to challenge them anyway. So then, in a sense, we are already in a place where we are perpetuating dominant ideologies. We're perpetuating particular sort of hierarchies and so on. So I think that's then, in a sense, we have, of course, a different sort of layers here. We actually have a particular framing of multilingualism in a policy context, in the sort of in kind of European Union type documentation, which is because of priorities of regulators and so on. When, however, we take this discourse to translate it in our sort of educational praxis, what we actually also need is to unpack what it is that we currently mean, what we do, and how we go beyond those constraints, which is very, very difficult. So we are in a place which is extremely complex, and it is much more complex than saying that, okay, we are committed to multilingual pedagogies in education. And I always like coming back to Bourdieu when we talk about competence, and we know, and we have again various good studies from different fields, and these are fields that often are very much kept separate. And I saw that when I started my work on pedagogic innovation, and transnational collaboration, that it is extremely rare that I have the opportunity to talk in the context where there are colleagues with no backgrounds. So and we had, Julie and I had this conversation over the years about how we also have those sort of silos in terms of who participates into those conversations and how we can benefit from the work that is happening in our kind of disciplines. But anyway, I think what we would all agree is that linguistic competence is not about the technical ability, it's not about sort of the skills part, but it is much more of a kind of statutory, that it has much more of a sort of political sort of dimension, as does ideology. So language is ideological. I think, as I said, I'm in Canada. I generally don't feel that I have to do very hard work to convince anybody about that. But I certainly, when I'm in a place where you actually you live and you see how that translates on sort of in kind of all the domains of life, I think that's very much part of thinking, okay, how can we actually really capture on that when we think curriculum or co-curriculum or whatever, right? So all those sort of binaries. And the kind of approach I take has been around understanding language as practice and understanding language as ways of doing. And my interest, as I said already, is to actually move from thinking about the language to thinking about the user, but without losing the constraints that are in place. So I'm very, very, very committed and always keeping the conversation, the socio-political constraints that pre-exist an encounter where users may have more or less agency. Because we could create a space here which is safe, multilingually speaking, but we operate in a wider context which comes with specific hierarchies. So it's, to me, it's fundamental that we actually also have that into the conversation where we're saying, let's create the space, fantastic. How that interfaces with everything else that our students or the users or those who would be legitimized to be in that space would have to operate. And that's something that I feel very strongly, because I feel very strongly if we were to say it is okay to legitimize practice that then would be penalized. And I have written on language penalty, on also the penalty, if we legitimize a particular praxis that then will be penalized when someone uses this particular approach that we take to publish or to talk to another audience and so on. So I'm interested in actually really thinking of, from an ecosystem perspective, how we can create sort of ecosystems where we empower our students to bring their linguistic repertoire, and how we do this operating in this sort of complex 3D sphere where all those sort of constraints, but affordances as well, right? I don't want to actually say we're not passive carriers of the constraints, right? It's not like my suitcase that I pack and I go. I do have a lot of agency, but it is also something that, in my view, needs to be explicitly discussed. And particularly when we, like ourselves in this room, we have a lot of power. We are part of a system, how and what we can do to make that system more open, more equal, more multilingual, and so on. So the educational reality is certainly not one where we actually find all this. And this is where I want to move to a case very briefly. And for any of those that I'm discussing, I can direct you to different publications and more material. And hopefully what I'm hoping is that today is the beginning of a conversation and we can continue talking on aspects of it. And this is it's a program that we've developed, we being with colleagues initially from Monash University, and we have an alliance. We work at Monash, we celebrated the 10 years of our alliance, I believe. It feels last year, maybe it was something like 5 days ago. Well, no, it wasn't. It was actually at some point past academic year. It was our 10th anniversary. So it is one of the established alliances, and it's also one of the really pioneering for its time in the sector, because it was a university level, vertical and horizontal, as I call it, alliance. So in the sense it was more than a university partnership, it was meant to actually really mean embedded partnership, both in research and in teaching and learning. So what we wanted to do was to create a school, a program on multilingualism and diversity, which we call MultiDiv, and we have what we wanted is to actually create a space where students from participating institutions and coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, and I can say a little bit more about that when we actually finish the part of the talk if you're interested, they would come together. They would mainly work on sort of taking a linguistic landscape approach to see multilingualism and diversity in society, and they would do this through their own empirical research in teams. They would actually then, instead of writing an essay, they would actually think how they could translate their voice to talk to a wider audience. So the students then have to report on their findings through blogs, we give them some sort of access to relevant space where they can disseminate their work. Okay, so the kind of the learning outcomes we want the students to have is both to see how they can bring their disciplinary approach into the topic. So the students don't have to come from a linguistic, language, education, or anything that we would consider a sort of cognitive discipline necessarily. They can come from whatever linguistic, from whatever disciplinary background, as well as a linguistic background, as long as they're interested in the topic area, and they would work to actually create this piece of work with other students. About 50 minutes, okay. And then COVID came. And then that meant that this work, the way we designed it, really was relying on the main modality we have for bringing students together, which was physical travel. And as you all know, that went out of the window overnight, which actually was a catalyst for a lot of creative thinking. So then we turned quite a lot of this work online. And what has also happened was that students were in different parts of the world online. So we went beyond having the work students and the mono students sort of not able to travel between the partners, but our students were all over the world, as I'm sure Toronto students were all over the world. And what I thought was a huge opportunity was to actually see how we could connect the students to really become each other's ears and eyes, to actually really do sort of linguistic landscaping within the sort of areas where they had access. And if it was actually really good that you actually raised that. I shouldn't take that everybody would know what we're talking about, but linguistic landscape broadly would actually be landscaping exercise, looking into which varieties of language are used and how that connects with issues of diversity in different social, political, economic, and other environments. So what we wanted the students to do is to be able to bring this pyramid together and to actually really benefit from creating and thinking of a space where we can truly challenge some of those sort of barriers where we actually have students only from particular backgrounds carrying out a particular type of linguistic or language, if you want to work, their sort of blended environment and so on. So I'm sort of trying to go a little bit faster, but we also wanted to think how we can move when we talk about multilingualism and diversity from spaces where we get the students together, we take their multilingual repertoire out of the equation, and we talk multilingualism to multilinguals without enabling them, empowering them, or legitimizing them to be multilinguals, more than some sort of type of practices that by now are quite established, like, for example, finding some reading lists or whatever. But, you know, reading lists in different languages, so what, right? And anyway, who issues of access to this information would apply and so on. So actually, I was always very unhappy with the kind of what we, with the number of things that we try and we kind of bring together multilingual pedagogies, but of course also it's extremely difficult. So we just need to think how we can do things from a sort of different perspective. We have a paper, as I said, we can actually, I can point you to kind of different the different publications for different parts of what I'm talking today, I'm touching upon today. So we analyzed multidiv, and what we actually thought is, okay, so those teams of students, what we want them is to carry out a piece of research. We want them to use the linguistic repertoire they have to collect and work on data without translating, without only focusing on the language that they have in common, or one person working on a set and then translating for everybody else, but really to actually give them credit for bringing this linguistic diversity into the mix and seeing how they could actually work in spaces where they wouldn't necessarily have access to each other's language, but they would need to create a coherent narrative around what they're finding. And we were expecting that this would be challenging for the students. Now, I'm going to go fast, so jump to the end and sort of, it's a little bit of a sort of spoil the kind of fun of the journey, but this is really was not what the students found challenging at all. So students did not found working within the sort of a multilingual ecosystem where they would actually have to find how to turn the fact that we had one student in Melbourne, one student in Coventry, one student in Shanghai, one student somewhere in France, so in Barcelona, how going and finding graffiti in different varieties and analyzing or find conversations in tea shops or cafes. They found ways to work in those multilingual spaces which were much, much more creative. And actually no student group so far for the last years that we have been running Multidiv actually brought the multilingual profile or the multilingual ecosystem of the team as an issue or complexity, which in itself I think is very important as a learning, also for ourselves, because we ourselves say, oh, multilingualism is framed as a problem. That is a problem. And then we ourselves have, it's so deep in the DNA that we ourselves catch ourselves being surprised when it's not a problem. And the students actually work very well on this. And that to me is absolutely much of an evidence of how much we are approaching multilingualism from a monolingual profile. Okay, I'm going to go fast because there is one last part of this talk. And as I said, this is reported in papers and so on, so I can actually direct you. What we actually found, so as I said, the multilingual issue was an asset for the students when they were legitimized to use it and they were legitimized to actually know that this is part of their assessment. And you actually have, if you just catch a glimpse of this, you actually see the kind of areas that they wanted to do their studies on, the kind of disciplinary backgrounds. What they found quite challenging is what we take for granted that the students magically will find ways to work, or okay, well, they will sort it out. So working at the interface of time zones, the management of translating what's the kind of a research question to a research project, collecting the data, managing the relationship, the interpersonal dynamics of teams. These were issues that actually were quite consistently recurrent. And they're issues for which we don't train our students, of course. So that is something that is very, very important. And when we talk about transnational collaboration and student mobility and so on, issues of how much our students are trained to actually work in those environments, beyond and has nothing to do with a sort of in and by itself with a sort of subject knowledge, is really very important part. So around the kind of the operational or the practicalities and issues around the sort of translating and moving from a sort of research topic to carrying out the sort of the work and translating for a wider audience is where we actually see that students need different support. Students perform extremely well. They take this for credit because I also don't like using co-curricular and extracurricular as the only way of innovation. It is to me like the same bad use of an appendix. I don't know how to put something in the text. I throw it in the bucket and you make sense of it. No, I don't like that. I like thinking, okay, how can that actually be acknowledged as part of what the students do for credit? And I also have very strong feelings about the fact that we project to the students the responsibility of doing things for fun when we have valorized their learning since they are in primary school. And I think colleagues here know, I know next to nothing for sort of the journey from a primary to HE, because for me, my area is HE. But we commodify learning on the basis of performance since the age of 5. And then students who come to our universities have worked extremely hard to come to our universities. And then we say, oh, you don't want to do something for the fun of learning. That's not unacceptable. Why don't you want to go to the library and just read? When we trained you for about 15 years to only do something for a purpose which comes with a particular valorized type of learning or teaching. So that's a different story, but that is part of why I feel very strongly of thinking how what we do may very well be in the co-curricular and the extracurricular space, but how does this interface with the curricular journey of the students, to me, is a really important part. Okay, so multi-div works very well with the challenges that I've started sharing. So what? So why is that different to a whole range of millions of other possible projects that work very well? Okay, so what we did, and then I'm sort of fast tracking really very much now, moving back to the opportunity that we actually have with alliances and European university alliances, is how we can actually really benefit from sort of the opportunity of connecting our students, and within the alliance that I'm going to turn and present for the last sort of 10 minutes or 5 minutes or so, what myself and the colleagues that actually work in the educational team, what we'll be doing is, as a model, was to try and see how we can create learning communities. Okay, and learning communities, I believe in community work, and I believe in connected learning and the concept of connectedness, and I think learning communities are really very important. So, and this is why and how I truly believe that we have, as a sector, beyond Europe, we have a moment for transformation that is not going to come back soon. And we really need to actually grab it and work to really think differently as to how we embed innovation into the mainstream of our offering. So this is a utopia. It's an alliance of 10 institutions. You see them on the slide. A lot of information online. So if you Google it, you will find all the pages and so on. I want to actually go very fast to what we did, and I can send you the paper. We're at sort of proof stage for this if you're interested in how we created what you see is a visual metaphor of creating innovation on expanding and extending existing practice, and then sort of use this as a way to create curricula where the students would actually work with others across the alliance without creating new programs, but actually embedding the kind of global learning activities within the existing practices of colleagues. Now, I've already talked about multi-div, and this is where I wanted to be, and the learning communities worked and were formed around learning, what we call learning units. These are typically courses or modules for credit existing in the partner institutions that could be used in some ways to interface and connect, or would actually be in areas where colleagues who come into this sort of the kind of the group, which hopefully is to become a community share. So they actually either offer content in those areas, there is research activity in those areas, there is interest in actually developing in those areas, would have in common, and would start seeing how we could create opportunities for the students to come together. Now, we don't exchange students, we don't share students, we don't add, and so on. Short point, what we actually found, so multi-div became sort of the spiel, this kind of conduit of creating a learning community, a connected learning community around multilingualism, which still exists and is growing. And if you click the link or go on the link and you write Utopia Multilingualism Learning Community, it would take you to the page where you would see a whole range of activities where students, where the students have opportunities to come and share the work they do, but also over the years, a number of other ideas evolved. So that was from creating a way to share existing parts of our courses, that these are courses of 10 partners sharing a whole range of different languages, to actually a student-led conference, the kind of opportunity to really build research activities and synergies on the colleagues who actually participated. So I only want to say one thing, which actually was part of how this learning community started growing, which is what we found was with the colleagues who actually came through shared interest and through existing practice, what we found was that we were asking students to do the same piece of work for different credit and for different purpose, but it was the same thing. Okay, so we're asking students to carry out research in, broadly put, a sort of kind of somewhere where they would see language ideology and language practice. So what we figured out is that without changing anything at all, we could give the students exactly the same wording. So just make sure that we, as the academics in that case, we were actually happy to very slightly edit the wording so that the students work on the same brief exactly. The students were to carry out the assessment for the exact reason they had to carry the assessment in terms of credit weight, in terms of the program. Some of the students were undergraduates, some of the students were masters. We didn't change anything at all. We just made sure that they have the same brief, which they did. And then we thought of bringing the students together to share their findings. And then we also thought of how hypocritical it would be if we asked the students who did all this work to translate all this to a language. So as always, when I have any difficult questions, what I do is to pass the question back to the student and say, let's work together. What is the solution that you would like to have? How can we work together? So their brief was to maintain the integrity of what they had to do and to find a way to share enough so that others would actually be able to see what they found, but also maintaining the language that, in a sense, they did in their work. And what the students did was to create, and that was a sort of very much the consensus that the students had, to create materials or handouts or slides in English and have the presentations in the local languages and the language of instruction they had. So that meant going from Swedish to, can't remember now if we had students from all participating universities, but we certainly had Swedish, we had Catalan, we had French, and so on. So we actually had an environment where the students moved towards a space where they could operate transitioning between languages and keeping the integrity of what they did. And that worked so well that the students, that's how the student-led conference was born, because the students wanted to have the opportunity for our students to participate, for more students to come on board and so on. And now we actually have the third of those conferences and so on. So it is growing, because part of my sort of really the work that I'm interested in, and I think we need to connect also and bring our collective power together. And that's why I was saying how excited I am that I'm here today, and hopefully we will continue having those conversations, is how can all those pass the test of scalability? Because if we were to do those experiments with 5 students, fine. What do we do with 100? What do we do with 300 in a course? And that's really where I think we need to come together. Okay, so this goes back to the need for having a structure for really building pedagogic innovation. I'm now referring to another piece of work of 2 years ago on reimagining research-led education. This is also online, and I can share, of course, where the way I see it is that we really need the policy tools, and we really need to work with in the EU context with member states, but with national regulators anyway. We need to work with international regulators, and we also need to think within the sector whether we are part of alliances or not, to bring together where we have experience of good practice, particularly when we have experience of good practice where we really work with different models of multilingual education, to think how we can actually really program and reimagine programming in this area. As we do this, one thing that I'm extremely very keen that we don't forget is the issues of resource and recognition, because although we talk a lot about parity of esteem between teaching and learning and research, we know that pedagogic innovation does not come with the resource that is required when we actually have the vision of really changing and transforming our offering. So we also really need to think of the resource and the recognition of effort that is needed to achieve the vision of sort of changing, synchronizing, enhancing, whatever word we want to use, our pedagogic offering. And that's something that to me is really important, that the work that we do in education often means that we have a number of colleagues from academic background, professional services, students who actually take this work on top of everything else they do, which shows by but unpaid enthusiast is actually something that I'm really concerned about, because this is the work of those colleagues that actually is not recognized, and it also means that we don't have the capacity and the commitment to put the resource that is required for all this work to move from a periphery to the mainstream. And I often refer to fireworks, educational fireworks, to refer to great work. There are thousands, if not millions, or if not, I don't know how many projects of the last sort of at least 20 years that gave good recommendations or good examples and so on. But a lot of this work remains as a firework. Something happens and then no continuity. And we need to have commitment to resource and recognition in terms of both the student effort, and that's why to me having things for credit is important, but also the work that colleagues put. So thinking about sort of, I don't know how much of this work translates when we talk about academic promotion criteria and so on. So to me, this is absolutely fundamental. So, and this is the last slide, in terms of connecting with multilingual pedagogies and sort of moving from the kind of ideal to a reality where we can actually shift and create spaces where we can legitimize and incentivize multilingual practice. We really need to think how we can actually have curriculum affordances, how the curriculum experience of the students would actually really allow or create space for that. We need to work together to understand practices and processes and how much we can actually test scalability, how much we can actually start offering the multiple different multi-tips that are out there that actually really deliver. How do we share good practice, and how do we actually really work together for methodological approaches? And I think at the moment we have promising programming coming from European University Alliances. How is that shared? How much is known? How can actually this, how we can make sure that we're done creating even more silos where we actually have practice that stays within a particular sort of context but does not communicate. And therefore think of the sort of the very much of the need for ourselves also to take on joint work. I don't have time for that, but I always want to sort of end with some of the voice of the students also not being absent from the conversation. And this is work that I've been doing when I took on my role. And I think I already mentioned that the first thing I do when I start anything new that has to do with education and reform is to actually bring students on board. And when my brief was to actually really see whether we as the University of Warwick wanted to have an internationalization strategy, and if yes, to design the strategy, was to actually really think, what do we mean? And it's like the University of Toronto, we're very international, we're very committed to international education, we're very committed to actually supporting our students. So I was very interested in actually to bring students on board to think, what is it that we stand when we talk internationalization? What is it that our students want? And what I don't have time to talk about that. This is work that I'm currently working on now on how for the students meaningful encounter with other students is fundamental, which is very much not how we often think about international, and certainly not the metrics that or that actually referred to earlier when we actually try to capture all the activity, or when we actually have policies and sort of our universities report on how international we are, because we are. But what does this actually mean for the daily experience of our students, of ourselves, of our partners, is something that actually is very diverse, and we need to capture and understand better this diversity. And I'm going to stop here.